Good afternoon. My name is Dave Norton from Discovering New England History. And this new program we're going to present is on New England involvement in the Civil War, and it's going to begin with the Abolitionist movement in New England. And we're going to come up with a lot of new facts here, hopefully, that you folks will be interested in. So to begin with, we'll start with picture one. And these are the main characters, if you will, in this story. Harriet Beecher Stowe, Amos Lawrence, John Brown, Bronson Alcott, Charles Blair, and Charles Sumner. And you can see a lot of these folks were heavily involved in the abolitionist movement, but they weren't really quite that well known in New England. So we're going to explore all these stories. So we'll go to slide 2. Now, to begin with, during the Civil War, beginning of the Civil War, of course, we start down south. This happens to be Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. And I visited that with my family probably 4 or 5 years ago. And we had a wonderful trip. And this is called Boone Plantation. And back then, cotton was king. Cotton was the leading export of raw materials in the entire United States back then in the early, probably around 1830 on. And this is actually Boone Hall Plantation. And what I have here is, got a close-up here, a movie was actually made, a made-for-TV movie called The North and South. And we didn't realize that at the time when we visited the plantation. And it was amazing because this movie, everything is shot here, most of it is shot on this plantation in South Carolina. It's very well preserved. And of course, this TV movie, North and South, they had 3 different episodes, 3 different books here, starring Patrick Swayze and many other stars were involved in this production. It's quite a production here. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, in this plantation, you can imagine this. This was actually a long driveway coming up, and I took a picture of this looking back down from the plantation, and you can see this long avenue lined by trees, and that's typical of plantations down in the South. And we'll go to the next picture. Now, back then, like I said, cotton was king, and there was slavery all throughout the South. And basically, slaves were used to pick all the cotton, and they put it in bales. And this is a typical sketch of what was involved in picking all the cotton. They worked from sun up to sundown, and that was part of the culture in the South before the Civil War started. We'll go to the next slide. And I took this picture here. This was actually at that Boone Hall plantation. And you can see they're still in existence here. Those are rows and rows, I mean, as far as you can see, of the slave quarters. They were made out of brick, and you can see they've got wood shingles on a roof, but you got a dirt floor on it. And it was a terrible existence. And they're still there, and that was part of actually this movie North and South. A lot of it was taken inside these slave quarters, and they did a dramatic portrayal of what it was life was back in the day with slavery and on the plantation farms. So we'll go to the next picture. And this was an actual photo. And this is how they shipped it. They took all the cotton, put it in bales. You can see all the bales stacked there. And a riverboat would come up, and they would load the riverboat, take it down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, and from there it would be exported all over Europe. Primarily England was large, where it took most of our exports. And you can see that there's an actual picture back there in the early 1830s or 1840s. We'll go to the next picture. Now, I went to Memphis, Tennessee also on another vacation. We went out to visit a lot of the sites. And this was along the Mississippi River bank in Memphis, Tennessee. And you can see there's a couple of riverboats on there. I took this way back. It's a faraway shot. But I was amazed because on the riverbank, if you look really closely there on your TV, It's not your typical riverbank. Your first indication is, oh, okay, there's no trees, there's no shrubs. You know, it's probably all a muddy riverbank, but it's not. I mean, it's all cobblestone, and it goes down as far as you can see, probably a half mile, maybe even longer, of cobblestones on an angle going down to the riverbank. So I asked one of the historians down there, why is this cobblestones on a riverbank? And of course the answer was, when they picked the cotton, they put it all in bales, and they would stack it all up here as far as you can see, and that protected the cotton from the putting them on the muddy riverbank. And then they could take that, load it on the river boats, and send it down the Mississippi River. So that's really interesting. Part of history, and that was a huge culture in the South, exporting raw cotton. We'll go to our next picture. Now, Harriet Beecher Stowe, she was very important at the beginning, early part of the, before the Civil War. She was born in 1811, and she was born in Litchfield, Connecticut. So we'll begin with her story and how she affected the Civil War. We'll go to the next picture. And that's the Stowe House in Litchfield, Connecticut. That's a terrific sketch, shows you what it was like back then. You can see the horse and carriage, and that's was main transportation. You can see it was quite a nice house there. Beecher Stowe House in Litchfield, Connecticut. And unfortunately, the house no longer exists. Apparently, they couldn't save it and was demolished. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, she went her schooling. She was very well educated, quite an intellectual. Their whole family was very religious, and she went to school here at what they call back in time the Hartford Female Seminary, and that was actually one of the first colleges for women in the country, and a lot of people don't really recognize that. Basically, back in the day, all the men went to the college and the women didn't. That's quite a different part in history. And that's where she went, and then she graduated from that seminary because she was very involved in religious activities, and she actually became a teacher there. And she taught there for quite a few years. So we'll go to the next picture. And I really enjoy these postcards. When you ever get some of these old postcards, if your family has them and collected them all like that, they're really quite valuable today. Here's an actual postcard of the Beecher Stowe House in Litchfield, Connecticut. And then when you go back and get these postcards, you can actually tell what the the colors of the home was back in time, which is kind of interesting. Once again, there's the horse and carriage and someone sitting on the front porch. The Beecher Stowe House, that's where she was born, from Litchfield, Connecticut. It's quite a New England story. And we'll go to the next slide. Now, I often wondered here exactly how in the world does she ever get involved in abolitionist movement and get involved in slavery. She lived a sheltered life, certainly educated and graduated from a seminary school, and there's really, how did she really write? We'll explain exactly what she wrote later, but how did she really get involved in slavery? So she moved to Cincinnati, Ohio in 1932 when she was 21 years old. And this is part of the story so folks can really understand how she got to become an abolitionist. So go to the next picture. And out in Cincinnati, Ohio, that's the Beecher Stowe House. That's where they lived. She moved out there with her father, and her father became president of a seminary back there. And she went along with him. They had a great opportunity, so she moved to Cincinnati, Ohio. And I'm saying to myself, I still don't understand the connection. So we'll go to the next picture. And one day, she decided, it's right on Cincinnati is close to Kentucky. So I guess one day, probably in a Sunday afternoon, she went down to cross the border into Kentucky. And she witnessed what they call a slave auction. And here's a picture of a typical slave auction. And that really put an impression in her mind, because actually the people up north really didn't have a really understanding of what was going on in the South and the plantations and the slaves and everything else. And when you actually witness something extraordinary like this, it just galvanized her. And she said, I have to do something about that. I've got to start writing about this and try to educate people. And that's how she really got involved in the abolitionist movement. So we'll go to the next picture. Now she moved again. She married another seminary student out in Ohio, and he became an instructor back in, offered an opportunity back in Brunswick, Maine. So when she was 39 years old, she left Cincinnati, Ohio, and moved to Brunswick, Maine. And she never forgot her experiences in seeing the slave auction. So she sat down in 1852, and she wrote a famous book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. And the first year it sold 300,000 copies. Now you have to think of that for a moment now. There's no Amazon.com, there's no TV, showing off your book on talk shows or whatever. How do you sell 300,000 books? Back then, it was a huge, an incredible achievement back then. In the first year, they sold that. And her descriptions of what it was like for slavery, living on the plantations, picking all the cotton, and how the slaves were treated by the plantation owners. Everybody read that book up north, and it just galvanized the abolitionist movement. So we'll go to the next picture. And here it is. It was published in 1852, and that's the actual cover of the book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And she subtitled it, Life Among the Lowly. And actually people up north just never, it wasn't part of their world. They just never understood what was going on down south. And this book became extremely famous, and it certainly is famous in United States history. So we'll go to the next slide. And in Brunswick, Maine, this is a nice painting, famous painting, and it's the Beecher Stowe house. And that's where she lived, and that's where she wrote the book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And that's certainly quite a place to visit. And I did some research, and I said, well, I wonder what this, if it's still there today, let's take a look. So we'll go to the next slide. And that's what it looks like today. So there's the house, and it's, you can actually tour it. And that's where Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's, the town got a lot of money up together, they preserved it, and they will be opening it up soon, as I understand it, so you can actually tour it. It's quite a piece of history. And we'll go to the next slide. Now she moved again. She moved to Andover, Massachusetts in 1853, so she really wasn't that long up in Maine. And then one of the other books she wrote was The Minister's Wooing. And there's a copy of the book there on the right, and that was published in 1856. And she wrote a series of books. And this book, I haven't read it, but it's based on life in Newport, Rhode Island, and it's a novel. And I have a picture here. I actually have the book myself. It's right here. That's the book. It's very fragile. I tried to open up and try to see if it was the first edition. There's no indication of that, but it's certainly quite old. And you can see the typical size of the books that they published back in the day, and you can see the nice cover on it. And it's supposedly all set in Newport, Rhode Island, before Newport, Rhode Island was a tourist spot in New England. And it's a novel with certainly a lot of religious overtones in it. The reason I didn't read it is that if you open it up, and I'm not going to do it here, it'll actually fall apart. So this is probably part of history here. So we'll go to the next slide. And Harriet Beecher Stowe, right after the beginning of the Civil War, she was invited by President Lincoln to go to the White House. So she went down there, and of course she had already written Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it was published all over New England, and everybody read that. And when she shook her hands with Abe Lincoln, this is the famous quote of the day that I'm sure a lot of people in New England aren't familiar with. And President Lincoln looked at her and said, "So you are the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war." That was certainly quite an introduction. And that's commemorated in Hartford, Connecticut, because that's where she actually ultimately moved to, and that's where she finished out her life. And that's actually a statue on in Hartford, Connecticut, right on a nice walkway right on the river. So that's a famous quote. Can you imagine shaking your hands with Abe Lincoln and him saying, "So you are the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war"? And of course, he's referring to the famous Uncle Tom's Cabin. He always wanted to meet her. So we'll go to the next slide. And I took this picture this summer. Harriet Beecher Stowe house, that's in Hartford, Connecticut, and she moved there in 1864, and of course the Civil War was still going on. And that's quite a house. It's great because you go in there, they have a nice visitor center, and you go in there and they let you go through room by room. Everything is all set up with period furniture. It's quite a place to go. They give a great tour. A lot of Harriet Beecher Stowe's, a lot of her original books, a lot of there's stories in each one of the rooms. It's quite a tour. And the house is actually right next to Mark Twain's house. So actually, if you park in the parking lot there, you can actually visit both houses right there at the same time. So we'll go to the next picture. And this picture I took, that's the back of the house, and that's where Harriet Beecher Stowe was. It's a National Historical Site. It's certainly one that, I'd urge a lot of people, if you have some time, if you ever visit Hartford, to really go through that. And of course, they have a picture of President Lincoln with that when he met her, and it's quite it's quite a house. She was certainly very famous for the book Uncle Tom's Cabin. We'll go to the next slide. We'll talk about Charles Sumner. Now, this is, of course, before the Civil War. He was a Massachusetts senator, and he was an abolitionist. And that's his picture there on the right. And we'll go to the next slide. And his house is on Beacon Hill in Boston, and that's a picture of it. Very famous in Massachusetts. And we'll go to the next picture. And what happened was, Senator Sumner from Massachusetts stood up in the Senate, and he made a really compelling speech against slavery. And he went on and on in the Senate floor. And of course, back then, between the North and the South, there were a lot of arguments. It was people getting very impassioned. It was before the Civil War in 1856. And the next day, a congressman named Preston Brooks from South Carolina walked right in on the Senate floor, had his cane, and he found Senator Sumner, looked him up, and with his cane, he kept on beating him and struck him in the head many times, knocked him down to the floor. He was so upset about the speech against slavery and against what was going on at the time in the South. And Senator Sumner never was the same again. He had lots of headaches, he had a lot of medical problems, whatever, and that hit the country. I mean, this went right across the United States and all the newspapers here. He was attacked by a congressman right on the Senate floor. It was shocking. It just happened. He just walked in, he attacked him, and just kept on beating him with a cane. So we'll go to the next picture. And that's a picture of, which I found on the internet, of Preston Brooks from South Carolina. And the actual cane that he used to beat the Massachusetts senator, there's a picture of it on the left. And that's actually in Boston, Massachusetts, in a museum. That certainly is a part of history of Massachusetts. we'll go to the next slide. And he has a statue. They have a large bronze statue of him, and it's in Harvard Square in Massachusetts. And a lot of people, I'm sure, probably walk by it, don't understand exactly what happened back then on the Senate floor right before the Civil War. He was a prominent abolitionist. And we'll go to the next slide. Now, Bronson Alcott. He was another abolitionist from Wolcott, Connecticut, and you can see, how do you describe him? Well, I just did it in 5 different words. He was an educator, he was a writer, he was a philosopher, he was a reformer, he was an abolitionist. And I'm a direct descendant of the Alcott family, so I was very interested, and certainly am interested in what he did during his life. So we'll go to the next picture. And this is a very important picture. That's his house on the site, and that's in Wolcott, Connecticut. He was born in Wolcott, Connecticut. And I wanted to see if that house was still in existence, and apparently it was all torn down. There's nothing there. So the house no longer is in existence. But there is a marker placed there exactly where the house is, and we'll show that in a couple slides. We'll go to the next slide. And in the back of the house, there's a barn, a very prominent barn, very, very old barn. And I'm going to have to contact the historical folks in Wolcott to see if that barn still survived from the day when Bronson lived in Wolcott. And if that is, that's a real extraordinary piece of history. So I took that from the backyard. You can see it's a large piece of property there. And that's a very interesting looking barn, which is next to a new house that they constructed on the site. So we'll go to the next picture. And this one I took, Amos Bronson Alcott, dedicated to him. That's the house, the site of where his house was. And of course, his daughter is Louisa May Alcott. And of course, I'm related to Louisa May Alcott. That was put in by the Bristol, Connecticut Daughters of the American Revolution. That's a famous bronze marker there, and that's quite a picture. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, the Fugitive Slave Act, that was passed in 1850. Just to give you a history of what's going on here up in New England, across the United States. And I summarized here what it's involved in. First of all escaped slaves were, upon capture, to be returned to their masters. So a lot of slaves were they would escape from the plantation, make their way up north to try to get to freedom, where slavery was not allowed. They were in free states, and Massachusetts were all free states. Item number 2, it was illegal to harbor runaway slaves. So if you were hiding slaves, you could be charged as breaking the law. It was an offense for hiding runaway slaves. And the penalty, if they caught you, was 6 months imprisonment plus a $1,000 fine. Now, $1,000 doesn't sound like much, but it's an awful lot of money back then. Very substantial penalty for, in other words, the slaves, if you caught them, they had to be returned to the government in your town, and then they would notify and try to send them back down south to the plantation. And the next item here is there are actually 23 known what they call safe houses in New England. And we'll be covering those on subsequent episodes here. It's really interesting, and a lot of these houses, they didn't want to actually be known as safe houses. So it's hard to, I'm sure there's a lot more, basically. And that's part of what they call the Underground Railroad. And they basically how did they get there? We'll be covering that in a couple other episodes. Very interesting. For instance, I read where the slaves that escaped in Virginia, what they would do is they would get on on ships, hide on regular cargo ships, and they would head up, stop at a port, probably in New Bedford, and then they make their way through from house to house on the Underground Railroad. And we're going to cover that story certainly in quite detail. And these houses were all along from town to town in New England, and there's actually, once again, 23 of the houses that have been documented. But it was a very dangerous type of thing. If you were caught with slaves, then you could be imprisoned, have to pay the fine. And actually at that time, it was in New England, they allowed, or in the country, if you were a slave owner, the owners would hire, they would hire men to go and get their slaves back. And they said it was illegal to go up north, house to house if you had to, from the south, to try to get slaves, to get your slaves back. It was just a whole different society back then. And this was all right before the Civil War. Now you've got Uncle Tom's Cabin, you've got senator from Massachusetts getting beaten, knocked down on the Senate floor. Now you've got the Slave Act here that came in 1850. So you can see all the tensions building in New England and across the United States. Of course, our #1 export was cotton down south. What are you going to do with that situation if all the slaves are freed? So you can see everything's really starting to almost boil over here at the beginning of the Civil War. So on our next episode, we're going to go in a lot of detail, and I'm going to show you. I've discovered many of these houses, and you're going to find this quite a fascinating trip through New England history. So once again, this is Dave Norton from Discovering New England History, and this is episode 1 of the Abolitionist movement in New England. So once again, have a good afternoon.